Welcome to Working Dogs and Whiskey. Join Sean White and Jonathan Moses as they pour a glass and dive into insightful and fun conversations about dogs in all their incredible roles. So grab your favorite drink and let's raise a glass to great stories, laughs, and a whole lot of dog talk.
All right, welcome back to another episode of Working Dogs and Whiskey. I'm here with Jonathan Moses, my friend and co-host. How have you been, man?
Busy, man. Busy. Just getting ready for the police academy, training Crash, getting Mona ready, and then training the pet dog as usual. Hadn't been too bad. What you got going on?
All right, for everybody else, who is Crash?
Crash is my new police dog. So got him from Jeremy Friedman out in California. This will be his third department, and he's doing pretty good. I say he had his issues coming in, but honestly, he's a good dog if you're clear in what you're doing with him and you understand how to read a dog properly. He's not a problem at all. Like, he's, for anybody watching, over my right shoulder here, he's laying down in his bed with his ball while we're recording this. But 2-year-old Dutch Shepherd, a lot of fun. You're actually going to get to work him, and not tomorrow, but day after. You'll get to work him and come see him. So that'll be pretty fun. I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah. Now, that's awesome. I'm looking forward to it coming out there and definitely get to work with you and work with him. So it'll be cool. It's a lot of hours spent talking about what to do. So it'll be interesting to record and, see what works and what doesn't. But, dude, this whole thing is messing me up with podcasting. So, like, right now we're recording episode, 13?
13, yep.
But it's like a weird matrix because it won't come out until, like, this will technically be our first episode of the year, I think. If that's correct.
You're right.
Yeah. So, yeah, because we have tomorrow's December 29th.
Yep.
So,
my brother's birthday.
Happy birthday, brother.
Yep. Darion. Yeah.
Darion, right? Yeah, I was going to say the one that I met. So, but this episode comes out tentatively around the first week of January. And then, our second week of January. No, first week. Yep.
First week.
Yep, first week of January. There we go. And then tomorrow, our episode 12, Chad Mackin, is coming out. Yep. So it's kind of weird that we kind of have to forecast, into the future, I guess, a little bit. So, but overall, I think it'll be good. The good thing is we're no longer being dog shit. I know it took us a minute to get this episode recorded, and a lot going on your end to get it done. And it's actually, for those that are listening, it's almost 11 o'clock on your time, 11 p.m. and I'm an hour behind you. But yeah, so it's going to be a late one, but I think it's going to be a good one too, given what we've already talked about. So I'll kind of dive into it a little bit. I just finished listening to, I think it's the latest episode as of yet of Training Without Conflict with Ivan Balbanov. Hopefully I'm saying that correctly. But he did a panel with several people, Mike Ellis, and forgive me, I can't remember. There was another doctor that breeds and trains German Shepherds, but I know she's in the, I want to say, behaviorals field. And then Doc Hilliard. And so one of the things that Doc Hilliard brought up was prediction versus control, or prediction and control, if you will. And it kind of reminded me of the e-booklet that we drafted up, and I think you finalized it and put it into production with it's almost synonymous of what we teach for clients, which is wants versus wanting to avoid, and which is all predicated off the dog being able to understand, predicting what the outcomes will be, and kind of diving into that operant side of things, and then being able to understand that it can control some of that. So that's kind of what I wanted to get into today. As far as, I think we should start out with maybe, what do you think, working dogs or pets?
Let's go working dogs first, or I think they'll kind of bleed together, but let's start
Right.
out with working dogs.
Okay. So I know my experiences with working dogs is in some of the latter parts of my career at Lackland, which was kind of the highlight of my training, was dealing with dogs that had, we'll say, issues, if you will, whether they were created by the human or, I'm sorry, I'm just looking at Crash in the background, walking
Just
back and forth.
walking back and forth
Yeah.
to place.
Yeah, and we spent probably about 30 minutes trying to decide should we let him out, but okay. All right. But anyways, but getting back to it, dealing with dogs that had some type of issues, typically speaking, they were oriented around outing and like things like that. And so I think when we were incorporating Doc Hilliard's philosophy, and this is just my individual interpretation of what he said, he has a very well outlined definition for it. But basically, through some Pavlovian conditioning, we create predictability in whatever behavior we want to construct. So I'll speak on outing just because that's a pretty common one I think most working dog people can relate to. And so one of the things that I notice is there is a lack of consistency on the training side of things, which by design would ultimately cause a lack of predictability for the dog. And so whether the dog can predict, punishment, negative reinforcement, or positive reinforcement, whatever the case may be, there has to be consistency for the dog to be able to predict something, the outcome that's going to happen. And then we tie it into a certain behavior. Again, classical conditioning or Pavlovian conditioning takes place. And then I think we kind of graduate into a little bit of operant conditioning, where the dog starts to understand that it has some control in how that plays out. So whether the dog is going to be punished or rewarded, it's able to first predict what's going to happen and then understand that it has control over, or it has influence over how that happens. Whether we result in, and for going back in terms of outing, the dog getting another bite or another grip, is predicated off of the actions prior. Did it let go when it received pressure? Did it react in the way that we wanted it to? And the dog starts to build a correlation. However, all of that has to be consistent in order to build the behavior. And I'll give one last example and then I'll turn it over to you. Same concept when we're talking about detection. There are a lot of things that I've seen in my time in the military where maybe odor isn't the biggest cue for sitting, which is the final response. And I could spend another hour talking about how we get to that point. There's all types of avenues to get to Rome, or whatever, as they say. But the biggest thing, the common denominator in a detection aspect, is that odor would be the predictor to sit, which would ultimately constitute reinforcement, is how we kind of want that to channel through. And I've seen things where, there are some gray areas built where odor doesn't always predict that. Odor could predict punishment if we're not very dedicated in observing the chronological order in which we do things. There can be some gray areas, if you will. So we try to construct a plan where it's very black and white. However we get there, if we have to cue the dog by, some people do physical touch, proprioception is kind of involved, where the dog has to be in a defined position, once it sniffs odor and all that. And that's not my preferred way of going about training detection. but it does yield its results. It does work. Just to me, it's a lot more steps involved than I care to implement, and a lot more input from handler to dog. So the way I like to construct it in that concept is I teach the dog a sit outside of odor. Dog then creates a strong, we create a strong reinforcement history with odor. Dog becomes aroused, and then we quickly graduate into, okay, you remember the sit thing that we constructed? We merge the worlds together. Now the dog is able to predict. I sniff, I hear sit, I'm going to beat that signal because dogs are opportunistic and they're going to go to the quickest route to positive reinforcement or the quickest route to avoid negative reinforcement, whichever, training style we're in. And then ultimately the dog starts predicting odor. Bam, I put my butt on the ground, I sit, and reinforcement should happen. I say, yep, I confirm his predictions. And the dog understands, makes an association. Obviously, there's a lot more steps to generalize it, but that's kind of the infancy stages in which we use predictability to our advantage. And then the control portion is when we start to generalize, the dog enters some area that it is technically not prepared for, and it has to make a decision. And that's where we deal into more of the operant side of things. Yeah, I can give you a verbal sit. Maybe there's something distracting. I've had things where cars have driven by, people are yelling, people dropped a Kong, unexpected events that are just outside of my realm of control. And the dog has to make a decision. Even though I sniffed odor, I heard a Kong drop. Do I turn and face it? Maybe I give him a small window to make an appropriate decision. And if it says nope, I'm infatuated with the Kong, then negative punishment is implemented. And by design, the dog learns, okay, I could have controlled that. What was the alternative? I could have sat and probably received reinforcement. And we go back with the hope of that will, take place. But all of that to say, that's kind of some of the areas I've seen it with working dogs. What about you, man?
So just to even touch on some of what you were saying with the predictability, it is an essential step. And one thing that you said where you talked about the cues that are given and how you like to do it in a certain process to not necessarily give so much handler help. I think the reason that's so important, especially as we're talking about predictability, we want the dog to be able to predict the behavior that's coming next, but we want to be very much in control of what predicts that behavior. So for me, that's going to be either verbal, like I say it, and this word or sound means this behavior, or I usually have some kind of action for it on like the prong collar or maybe like a hand signal or something like that. And that's the point I want to get to, where even those cues are as minimal as possible, because the dog does need to be able to predict. So as we progress, I want to be able to fade those things out. And I want these three things to be the only action or the only verbal that means this behavior. Right. And that's a huge thing. And me and you, I know we've been training together and we'll catch each other on it, where the dogs pick up on a cue we didn't even know we were giving them. Because again, they're relying on that predictability aspect of it, where they say, hey, I need to figure something out that tells me what comes next or what he's asking from me. Something I do when I would be telling my dogs it down, I would dip my head a lot, because I'd follow the dog down. So I'd give the hand signal into the down, my head would lean with it. And if I look down, some of my dogs will lay down. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a really big one, like where you were talking about minimizing those cues. That way you can effectively fade them back out, because you want to know very clearly what signals you're giving the dog. That could mean start this behavior. And something you brought up that as we're talking about it, that kind of plays into this whole thing is as you're doing more complex behaviors, like you talked about the dog sniffing odor, hearing the
Right.
verbal sit, and then sitting. Right. And like you said, dogs are opportunistic. They're going to cut out the middleman and predict what comes next. But before you can even get to that point, you got a dog that's aroused, understands odor means possible chance to access rewards. The dog has to have some concept of fluency in the behavior outside of that moment. Right. So you have to break these behaviors down. They have to be predictable. That way, as they kind of start compounding into more tricky things, the dog understands, even in this context, when I hear this cue or this signal, I do the behavior. And then your cue or your verbal signal can actually, the dog will skip it. It says, okay, I smell odor. I don't need to hear sit. I can go straight into it the second I find this odor because it's been so predictable. But if your sit's not predictable or generalized outside of that, then it's pointless. Like, it breaks the more complex behaviors. The dog's not going to be able to achieve it in that moment. Working dog wise, dog I'm about to start work again with here soon. I picked Coco up either Sunday or Monday. And one thing I have to establish for her is she pushes the button. We're going to do 1,000 reps of push the button, push the button, push the button, right? And this button, what it does is it alerts. Coco's a service dog, 2-year-old giant schnauzer. This button alerts her owner's parents that, hey, there's a medical emergency that's going on. But for this to be established, I have to get fluency in pressing the button. After I have fluency in, okay, I press the button, this is the desired behavior. Now I have to predict that behavior with some kind of sound. And eventually what's going to happen is I'm going to even add in a prior step of where I fall down prior to the sound that predicts press the button. So all of a sudden I have to have all these things established and all these things very fluid to create this behavior chain of what should happen and what steps. And the end result is I should fall, and before she hears the sound, that means press the button, she should say, I know what comes next, and kind of skip to the end of the behavior. But you have to have predictability and fluency in each one of these steps prior to kind of putting everything together. You can't train dogs if they can't predict what's coming next. You end up with very frustrated dogs. I know me and you had a conversation this week where even if the training is not the best and it's not intentional, sometimes the dogs are so motivated and willing to work either to avoid punishment or to access reward that they will pick up on cues trainers don't even know they're putting in there. They'll just say, hey, what do I have to do to figure out how to avoid this pressure or this ass whooping? What do I have to do to gain access to this reward? And me and you looking at it, it can make no sense to us, but the dog could pick up on small, minute things that it says, okay, this is part of the behavior chain. But that's also dangerous because if I don't know what cues I'm giving the dog, then even though the dog's predicting, it's a problem because I'm not aware of what signals predict the behavior.
Yeah, no, I almost hate how much we think alike sometimes. But yeah, one thing I wanted to circle back to, and I don't want to carry the conversation too much, but on service dogs. But so you mentioned, you kind of gave a pretty good synopsis of how to break down what you're going to do with this service dog with Coco, correct?
Yeah.
And so how do you start that out? Like, is the button going to be, what's the end goal? Is the button going to be attached to the person that it's, she's going to, or?
So the button's going to be set up in a couple of rooms throughout the house where the person is most likely to have the medical emergency. So the end goal is the person falls, the dog goes and presses the button. But it would be very hard, like just the actual process of I fall, go touch this button, and the cues and signals, there'd be too much for me to phase out. So the way I'm going about it is I'm going to just get established pattern of you come over, you press this button just accesses a ton of reward for you, right? Like this is your primary objective to get what you want. Then I start to preface that with some kind of sound or tone. What happens after that tone begins to predict the behavior, once I have that behavior very strong, is now I can give my body signal of me falling, preceding the tone, and the tone predicts press the button. So after repetitions of this, what happens is I fall. At some point, Coco will go, nope, I know what comes next, and go straight to the button. So now the act of falling will supersede the tone of pressing the button. But again, if I don't have strong desire or understanding or fluency to press that button prior to all of this, the foundation isn't strong, then there's no point. It'll be lost in translation if I don't have my cues properly established of what I'm asking from the dog.
Got you. Yeah, and because I think, and the only reason I'm like really hard pressed on like that subject particular is because I don't. Maybe it's just me. I don't know a lot of people that do service dog training. Um, I mean, I know groups of people that do it. Whatever for agencies or whatever companies and stuff like that. But I don't know like a lot of people just around and about that do that type of work. And so, but I like the ability to encompass like everything kind of follows the same protocols, if you will, to a certain degree. How we go about it, some nuances are different, sure. But for the most part, there it may be a complicated task to someone like me that's never been experienced in that or heavily experienced, because I've worked with you on a couple of service projects, but I've never taken one on my own. So every time I hear those stories, dude, I'm like, yeah, I'm gonna just train this dog to do this thing. I'm always infatuated. I'm like, how the hell do you do that? Because it's no different than watching the dogs that dance with people at the circus or
Yeah.
even agility. I'm just not well versed in it, so it just creates an arousal and a stimulation. So that's why I always ask about that.
I think one of the most fun dogs is probably Hush Puppy. Teaching him to wake his owner up on the sound of the alarm. That was
Oh
a fun
yeah,
one.
dude. Yeah, no, I forgot. Now we have to talk about it.
Nah, it was simple. The dog heard the alarm go off. It'd go jump on its owner in the bed and like jump up and down on him.
Yeah,
and it
but
was almost the process was almost the
what were
exact
we?
same.
There was something about Hush Puppy. I'm trying to remember.
Oh, it got really
'cause-
complex. It just got really complex because then we were like, wait, does this dog have to run through the house to come get her? Is it going to be in the room? Are there other people awake that it has to go by? Will it do food refusal if the kids are eating breakfast and they need to go wake up mom? So all of a sudden we're thinking about all these variables and we're like, oh shit. It ended up being simple. She wakes up like crazy early in the morning. The bed was right next to her, his bed. So it was like a straight shot, like a 6-foot jump. I actually brought him to my house for the weekend to make sure he would do it. And I mean, he did just fine. So it's that was a fun one. That was interesting.
Yeah, no, that's what it was, the bed that I remember, because it came out, we were working it, and I think you were like laying flat on the ground or whatever, and I asked you, I was like, this is why I fucking hate this shit, because there's so many variables. I was like, does he know that he has to go into an elevated position?
Yeah.
To a bed, and you're like, fuck, dude.
Yeah. I remember I
think
started practicing on the couch.
No, yeah, and you used Lilia, your wife.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like, dude, we're gonna have to generalize this. And I was like, I don't know what to tell you. I can tell you that what we're doing currently, because they look good. We got him consistently. You would lay down or whatever the case may be, and he'd hear the alarm. We had the classical conditioning, predictability, whatever, and then he would go to the alarm, hit it or jump on you, and I was like, we just got over one small hurdle, dude, of training. I was like, he is nowhere near being complete, and I was like, this is got a long ways to go. But no, that was awesome though, that you were able to take him and do that.
Yeah, he was fun.
Yeah, that's one way to put it. I don't know. I look at that and I think it's out of my wheelhouse, man. It's more work than I intend. I like to observe the training and see how it's it evolves and progresses, but to know that I'm obligated to it, I don't think I would.
Yeah, I asked for like a 2-month extension on training that dog just to generalize everything. It took me a while. I think he was there for a total of 3 months for me to get it where I was like, okay, I feel really good about this. I can definitely do it faster now, but that first one took a while. But dude, it all goes back to the same stuff. Ouch. Flights. Sorry, Crash is over there fucking with his bed. No, but it all goes back to predictability, man. Like once he understood what the behavior was, and it started with me cueing him to jump on my lap. I'd give him like a verbal cue. Come jump on me, click and mark, click and mark, click and mark. Once that behavior is predictable, now I could give him a signal prior to giving him my verbal cue. So ding, 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 alarm goes off, verbal cue, jump. Right. And then I change positions. And again, the dog could predict what was coming next. So he was able to have some clarity. With that fluency comes speed and more understanding of what the expected task is and how to access his reward. So that was the big thing. And then the tricky part is when we get to the proofing stages, right? Because predictability is great. I'd rather you listen to me than predict all the time or guess what's going to happen next. So when the dog started going, okay, I just want to jump on you all the time, all of a sudden we start using negative punishment, or I'll give him another command. And if he says, no, I want to jump on you, that usually works out pretty well. Nope. No reward or punishment, whatever we decided in that moment. Because again, listening is more valued than predicting once we get to the final product.
Yeah, so basically what I'm hearing is there's kind of a layered process, if you will, when it comes to predictability. And there's about two ways you can really go about it. Either the dog will predict punishment or it will predict reinforcement. And obviously we want to aim for the model of positive reinforcement, but then there are certain times and criteria where the dog will need to predict punishment, whether it's after the positive approach first, or maybe we need to decrease some behaviors. So like pointing case, a client dog, if we're going to tailor it back to pet dog training, like we said, we've already covered the working dogs. So I have a client right now that the dog has already been trained by a reputable company, and I know them personally, the people that train the dog. And I'm observing on the evaluation, the dog is just completely resisting the prong collar and the pressure. And what it initially was a predictor of, hey, stay with me, right? And I'm sure you've seen that quite a few times over the years. But so I'm analyzing this, and I'm like, the predictor for negative reinforcement is now, through her engineering, has been made into something else. And so the dog feels as though it can control, the amount of pressure it will receive if it goes further than the client's desired distance or proximity. So what that looks like in layman's terms is the dog is foraging or going ahead of her when it should be right next to her, right? And so in my mind, I'm like, I will do my best, but there's a lot of other elements and variables at play. The biggest one is going to be time that's operating against me. So I may have to reconstruct some of the signals for negative reinforcement. And that may come through a dog dominant collar or slip lead, if you will, vice using the same equipment that it's already built such a strong association with. And so as I'm watching this dog, I'm like, all right, this is probably where I'm going to end up at, is reconstructing negative reinforcement or her ability to predict negative reinforcement. And we will have to really outline the proximity piece where the dog will want to avoid punishment basically by not going outside of proximity. And so, there's a lot where, yes, of course, we're going to use negative reinforcement to get the dog into the behavior. We're going to use positive reinforcement to get the dog out of the behavior and all that good stuff. We said it 1,000 times on this podcast. That's nothing new. Nothing we're going to really say here is going to be new. But the things that I'm focused on is how do we define the lines of predictability and punishment, and then teaching the dog that it can control that when punishment is implemented, when the pressure is turned on, vice trying to actively work to turn it off. So, and one of those methods is, I will say, that is very good if you don't have a lot of time to invest in your dog in the positive reinforcement realm, is the Keeler method of just doing, some people call it a heel away, or doing multiple right turns, where the dog starts to forage, we go in the opposite direction. Usually for a dog, they're placed on the left-hand side. Pressure's turned on for maybe a fraction, a second, if you will. And then it's immediately alleviated by the dog just following pressure and coming with you, right? And so that is, in my predictions of how training is going to go, ultimately where the dog will fall when we're talking about healing and reconstructing it with the slip lead, where eventually the dog will predict when I turn to the right, it should go with me. And then that'll ultimately graduate into the dog feeling empowered in the behavior because it understands that it can control that by just moving with me, if that makes sense, in that realm. And that goes in so many different areas of dog training, life, and things like that. But I think the biggest thing is if the dog cannot predict, it cannot control, right? And so that's where we see a lot of superstitious behaviors, the things that I'm seeing with her currently, even though it's on a prong, because of the lack of consistency and ability to predict, the dog has become reactive even on a prong. It's resisting, the healing process. It's resisting some of the cues to sit with the prong if another dog is around. And so it's kind of been reformed into reactivity. And nothing against her, because of course she's not a dog trainer. She's not doing a podcast at 11 o'clock at night talking about dogs. So why would she know that? And this is just a little golden nugget for trainers or people that are aspiring to train dogs. I look at that, and part of my assessment is, yes, the dog may have received boarding training, and the dog may be, or used to be, very fluent, because she even admitted that with her original trainers, the dog was good the first couple of weeks when she came back. Very traditional narrative. But one of the things I'm seeing is that it's not just the dog. She needs to understand. And that's where we dive into, we're going to be doing essentially some day in trains with me for about a week or two. And then I'm going to incorporate her with one-on-one privatized lessons that are oriented towards her so that she can understand how to be consistent and how to be predictable and communicate with her dog. And I think that's where we're going to bridge that gap. But I know you've been writing notes, man, so what's up?
No, just taking notes on what you're saying, and you're spot on, man. Like everything you said. One, the dog feeling like they're in control of the situation by being able to either beat the pressure, right? Of saying, hey, if I go ahead and comply, there's the opportunity for reward as well as I can avoid the pressure. I do believe you need those two pieces. There's the want and then the must. And I feel like those have to be incorporated. So I want to work for the possibility of reward, but I must do this to avoid some form of punishment or pressure, right? So spot on with that. And a lot of the dog's ability to feel comfortable and confident in what they're doing is knowing how to navigate those options. So the dog can choose to be disobedient, and even then the dog is confident in that choice. Now I'm going to utilize pressure to persuade it to the choice that I want, but the dog is comfortable. Like you said, you don't see a lot of that superstitious behavior when the dog has clear understanding of, this is how I avoid pressure, this is how I access reward, and this is what I've clearly been corrected for. These are the rules, right, that have been outlined in front of me. So that's actually a big one. I hadn't really thought about the whole superstitious behavior thing, and that just coming from lack of understanding of controlling the outcome a lot of times. So that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, and I think, because I was just sitting here thinking about the superstitious behaviors and just kind of where they get constructed from. And I mean, it's across the gambit between working dogs, pet dogs, whatever, sport dogs, and stuff like that. And I think there's an element of lack of consistency, but I also think there's, we create a sense of hope in the wrong direction by the alleviation of pressure in inappropriate times, whether it's intentional or by accident. And I know I told you about the dog, well, not one specific dog, but I've seen it, a couple of working dogs, where if we're, again, going back into the outing process, where people will use a choke chain and they'll just theoretically, it should work, right? The dog, you put a choke chain on the dog, apply appropriate pressure until the dog releases. Once the dog releases the item, then pressure's stopped, and that should be, theoretically enough to convey to the dog to want to avoid something. But in some cases, it's just not enough. The moment the dog accesses another grip or is rewarded for the behavior, maybe it's not enough for the dog to process, I should have avoided that. The pressure incorporates that into the behavioral chain. And once you have that process, you create a quote unquote superstitious behavior with outing, where the dog actually just learns to bite down harder. And it says, when I feel pressure, I must go with it in the fact of I must write it out in the hopes of that it will be alleviated and I will get I'll get another bite or another grip. And there's protocols that I've used to get the dog to understand there's a different process, especially if it knows obedience. Then I'll have it sit down and do secondary obedience, which prolongs the bite, negative punishment. And the dog says, well, which is the quicker route? And like we spoke about before, dogs are opportunistic, and over repetitions, the dog starts to correlate, all right, if I just let go, as soon as I feel pressure, I could avoid the whole situation. But when we get into pets, because even that dog, I was like, how the fuck does she undo, some pretty good training?
Yeah.
And I know we talk about it, and it's just, it just always mind blows me when I see it live and in person. And and that's some of the stuff that I thought about. But I think her administration of pressure, I'm willing to bet, was not quite enough to influence the dog to say, okay, reactivity is not worth it, and then wait for positive reinforcement. Or she probably got away from positive reinforcement very quickly and figured maybe she could only utilize the prong. Who knows? I've only done one session with her, so more to follow with that. Maybe it's interesting how people can construct those things by the dog's inability to predict consistency or predict reward versus punishment and things like that, and then they just deviate back to the behavior that they were brought into training for.
Yep.
So
yeah, no, and you're spot on, man. It's something I really like that you talked about too, is the importance of teaching the handler or the owner, of the pet dog, whatever it is. Again, it goes back to what we started out saying. If the dog does not understand the system, or you don't know what signals you're giving, it's just going to cause more confusion and chaos. That clarity is what makes the dog feel like they are in control of the situation, or at least confident in the outcomes presented before them, because they understand this causes pressure to happen. This signal means I have an opportunity for reward. I perform the behavior in this timeline or under these circumstances, and I'm well within the rules. So again, like, it all just kind of circles around that whole thing. Being clear, being precise in what you're doing, and making sure your signals are very thorough and intentional. Right? You don't want accidental signals. Those are very hard to replicate if you don't know what's going on with them.
yeah. So I want to pick your brain real quick, and we'll kind of do it live, because I know we normally just talk about this and then go through training. But so I'm thinking about like the prong collar, right? That's now deviated from a sense of clarity to now a sense of confusion. So I want your thoughts on like how would you address that? As far as counter conditioning equipment that I would say has been somewhat poisoned or tampered, if you will.
Yeah. And I'm actually doing something similar. I told you that mal I got that they let pull on the choke chain and do all that other stuff, and I had to recondition it.
Oh no!
So my
so you have to go in depth. What did you say? You were trying to teach it to sit, and it was just hell bent on. I got it, dude. I'm gonna stand here.
Yeah, they got this Malinois. She's probably 75, 80 pounds. And they let her pull stuff around on a choke chain. So like she would do weight pulls, she'd drag them down the street, she would drag whatever they hooked up, and that she always just had this choke chain on.
Yeah.
So when I got her and I'm trying to teach her like directional information with the leash, she was so resistant to pressure and that it meant go opposite. Like it was the most well-conditioned opposition reflex I've ever seen. And I had to apply a good bit of pressure. But what you do for situations like that, I still had to get the directionals. I added some luring in there until the dog would comply with the pressure. Still took more pressure than I would have preferred, but very similar kind of circumstance.
Mhm.
I'd have loved to just use the slip or a choke chain or whatever. I can't. So the process that I would do for your dog and for the dog I'm currently training, I change up the equipment, right? So whether that's going to a slip, I've seen a lot of dogs come in that have the same issue that you're talking about, and I'll go from the, let's say they come in on a 3.2 millimeter prong, which is one of the bigger ones. So
Right.
for anybody watching, this is a 3 millimeter prong. This is the short links, but 3 millimeter prong. What I'll do is I'll recondition that using a slip leash, make sure the directional information is good in a certain context. And then when I need to use the tool, I may switch it up to something like a 2.25 millimeter prong, which is smaller. There's going to be more pressure. This signal coming from these two different kinds of leashes are going to feel very different to the dog, right? So sometimes you can get away with switching the equipment out.
Right.
So what I would probably do in that situation is go through, I would layer everything in with negative reinforcement using the slip leash, reestablish some of those previous signals and cues, make sure they're clear. Once I know they're clear, if the slip lead isn't the most efficient tool, a lot of times where I find that, like you're talking about forging on the leash, or if it's a reactive dog that likes to move forward, a slip leash is great because I can get the dog to comply. If it's like a yippy dog or likes to bark a lot, it's much easier to correct that on a slip leash with some ROA, removal of air. So I can apply that pressure and get that dog to be quiet much quicker. But with a prong collar, I feel like it's an easier handoff for a lot of first-time handlers or dog owners or just inexperienced even. It doesn't even have to be first off. It's just a more fluid piece of equipment. They don't have to have their timing quite as solid. So a lot of times I'll get the slip leash pretty smooth. I'll make sure the dog understands what I'm looking for and what the criteria is in a certain behavior. And then I will go from a 3.0 millimeter prong to a 2.25. And I'll layer in that same pressure and corrections, and I can switch that signal up. I've had to do that with dogs who people got, and maybe they just had a mini educator and they hammered this dog in a mini educator with no prior context, and they just jacked it up. And now the dog is somewhat numb to the mini educator. It kind of doesn't, like, the pressure doesn't mean much to that dog. I can switch to a different brand of e-collar sometimes. So sometimes I can go to a Garmin or a sport dog and I can recondition it. I had one dog who was just hell-bent on a Dogtra. Like Dogtra, he'd feel the stimulation coming from it, and it meant do XYZ, right? Like he would just become more aroused. He would fight it. But I was able to go through, use a slip leash, recondition a lot of our cues and our context and expectation while in behavior. And then I could layer a different piece of equipment. Even though it's an e-collar, that stimulation coming through it feels different. So I could go through and put like a Garmin on that dog. If that kind of answers your question.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm stuck. I started thinking about what you were saying about as far as the prong. I will say I can't say wholeheartedly that I would disagree with prescribing that to clients, just because there's two components that I look at that I've seen from doing the pet dog stuff. One, I think, yes, I would agree that fundamentally and theoretically the prong is the better option. It's least invasive and, in that regards. But I almost want to say, and I'm going to test this out with her, but I think that using a slip lead, if you're able to incorporate private lessons like we're going to do, I think that's more of the user friendly. Because one of the first things I noticed was, one, her placement on the prong with the prong was, it had a link. It was probably one link too big, for the dog. And then two, the placement, it was on its shoulders. So, now that I'm recalling the whole event. I'm like, maybe the dog can't, is making its new prediction because of the placement. Could be, and that goes along lines with consistency. But I know for the few clients that I have worked with the slip leash, one, they don't really question where to place it. Like, it just makes sense to them. It's like almost indicative. Um, but and then the other part of it too is people's natural ability to it's just human nature. I'm sure there's some science that would back that up and suggest it, but it's easier for people to identify things that are going wrong by going right, which by nature would say that it's easier for you to punish the things that you don't like, vice reward the things that you do like. And I recalling that from working with police officers, military, and even clients, and even watching some sporting or sport training, when I've been in the positions to instruct, I find myself having to remind people two things: either remind people to reward or remind them not to punish something, way more than I would, having to worry about them not punishing something, if that makes sense. So it'll be interesting to see. But yeah, that's this is a very interesting thing.
Yeah, I would say the owners that are more dedicated, and you can tell, like, they're doing their homework, they're getting in extra reps, they ask you more questions. They're the ones I feel more comfortable giving a slip leash to, because they're going to get the repetitions and understand how it feels and what that timing looks like, versus your typical dog owner. I hate to say it that way, who's like, hey, I just want it done. Right? They're typically the prong collar route. Just the something I've noticed, but I would say if they're dedicated, I definitely I prefer a slip in most situations. Like, if you ever see me walking my dogs, I've usually got a slip on. I can control a lot more of the slip because I can apply as much pressure as I want to. The prong collar is going to limit you after a certain point.
Right.
So it's, in my mind, it's definitely the more universal tool. But it all depends on owner dedication for sure.
Yeah, that's fair to say, dude. No, I'm just recalling, like, when you say owner dedication and all that, and it's amazing to me because I'm going on a little tangent, whatever, but and you'll see it, there's handlers that handle their dogs, and even more in your case, hello, Crush, in your case, where your life is on the line, and if you ask them, like, the deep thought and how to train their dog and all that, no fucking clue.
No.
Like,
yeah.
no clue. And I'm not shitting on, like, police handler. Like, it's across the board, military, whatever, and everything. Everything that I already listed, you can find them anywhere. But it's just amazing to me that, I mean, you can have somebody that competes at nationals in a sport, has no idea how to train that dog. But and it just reminds me of effort, where you were talking about with effort. But it's got to be there if you're dedicated to a discipline of some sort, whether it's I want my dog to lay down or go in the crate. You have to have some type of fucking rudimentary understanding. But
even
I mean,
that video from the worthless handler video you sent me today,
yeah,
where that dog. So if you haven't seen the video, canine handler sent the dog. Officer ahead of him ran past the civilian who was not the target, right? Ran past the civilian, called that dog to him, and then gave the bite command and sent him past an innocent bystander, right? And that's not something, you don't just do that, right? Like, that's training. You can tell that team has worked together. They've prepped for these situations prior to. Those are disciplined canine handlers.
Yeah.
And then you've got some who can't get their dogs out the fucking car, look like they've never held a leash.
Yeah, and I mean, in that specific scenario where, because I read the description of the video, and a lot of it had to do with understanding that prediction for the dog. Like
Yeah.
the door popper doesn't mean go out and just nuke the first motherfucker that you see, and that takes dedicated training to do that. And that's something that, even when I was operational, I tried to instruct with my guys was, for whatever element of training, like especially when you're talking in biting, you have to make sure that that is on a variable reward system and
Yes.
there's some level of listening skills being incorporated. And you may get away with it in the sports arena a little bit more because there's certain drills depending on what sport you're doing, where it's just the protocol is always the same. Will equal bite, and I'm totally okay with that. Keep doing that. Hell, I'm probably going to do it in Mondio Ring. I'm sure there's somewhere in there. But when you're talking about operational level, and when I say operational, I include pet dogs because they probably get some of the most wild shit thrown at them.
Yeah.
Like they don't know day to day what's gonna happen. You go on one vacation, you're like, hey, we're taking Sparky to fucking Yosemite, and
Yeah.
now there's a bear. Something. It's just you can't really predict. Police dogs, I would imagine the same thing. I've never done it. You're gonna see it firsthand, but like I would say they're probably second, as far as how much you can generalize and develop strong listening skills.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's interesting that there's a lot of situations that, of course, you cannot prepare for. Like,
Yeah.
you just hope that the training sticks. Like that guy in that worthless handler video. Dude,
Yeah.
I had to watch it like 3 different times. I was like, holy shit. Because that shit was funny. He just jumped over my man, bro.
He
It's like a
pushed him
guy
real
on the
quick.
ground. He
Get
just
down.
bops him on the head and leaps over him like a leaf frog almost.
Yeah.
And but it's like, do you really predict that you're gonna do that in training? No, there's some generalization that's happened with the dog, and you can hear him coaxing the dog, giving him more or less consistent cues. I think it's the same cycle of some different commands like keep going or something like that. But whatever the case may be, but he's coaching the dog along, and the dog is successfully, led to an appropriate bite from what it seems in the video. But all of that is off of, maybe initiated prediction. But like we said before, once the dog can understand prediction, now we have to implement control. And it comes
Yes.
on both ends of the leash. The dog has to understand that it can control, it's no different than hush puppy if we tie it back to him. Negative punishment. Oh, I don't get rewarded if I just run out and start jumping or whatever. And just voluntarily trying to skip the middleman of the alarm. No, there's a procedure that you have to follow. And then same thing for that dog. He's been through some type of neutrality training with officers and other people, and probably has been corrected for biting the wrong person, in training, I would imagine, or maybe
Yeah.
in real life, whatever the case may be. And now it understands, okay, I could predict when I hear these cues, I'm going in for a bite, but I need to understand my parameters and control that by himself off leash. And so, and that's what he was able to incorporate. So good on whoever that guy was.
Yeah. That was smooth.
Yeah, it was some good stuff to see.
Yeah.
All right, man. It's almost midnight for you, almost 11 o'clock my time. Anything else? Any last minute?
No, I think we kind of covered everything. Predictability, making sure you know what your cues are that you're giving your dog, proofing and listening, over predicting, right? So there's a certain point where we have to say, what did I say? Versus what do you think is going to happen next? And then just generalizing that, right? Putting in a bunch of different scenarios, making sure the dog can do it in almost any situation. And like you said, that's whether I just need you to lay on this place bed in this context or be beside me and heal for your pet dogs, or I need you to run past an innocent bystander, listen, and go get the correct person, right? So it applies across the board: pet dogs, working dogs, service dogs, whatever. So I think we pretty much covered it. Like you need to be predictable. You make sure you're very clear in what you're predicting, but you also need to make sure your dogs listen.
Yeah, I'll add one last thing just because You brought it up. I think there's two different elements in predictability. There's the initial when we're trying to construct some type of reflexive response in behavior and signaling. So like sit, dog puts his butt on the ground, down, dog drops, whatever. And in that sense, I think that's more the lines of what Doc Hilliard was trying to, without having him here to, fend for himself. My interpretation of what he was trying to advocate for is that the dog can eventually predict this signal that was once foreign actually means behavior, drive into a behavior. And then once we have gotten reliability or consistency and reflexibility in that signaling process, and the dog can predict, then we teach the dog that it can, in some degrees, control itself. And then there's a different element as what you just described, and I'm not going to spend a long time redefining what you just said, but where we don't want an association or an associative skill being brought into every element that the dog's going to be in. So, point in case, like you said, the door popping. Or even, again, I try to tie it to most things. Pet dogs, the door opening in your house means go out and run for freedom. We want to balance some of that predictability. Sometimes I will let you out if you're a reliable dog and I can trust you. Other times I'll let you know to wait until I put a leash on you or whatever the case may be. So there's different elements of predictability in which we work with and we leverage for dog training. But both are good, components to understand and definitely needed for any level of dog training or just cohabitation, really. I mean, you're doing it right now with your dog. He's in the background. I saw him when he came up. You patted him. You didn't just shove him off. You're like, all right, dude, what's up? And you're, building that cohabitation with him. So, the dog's learning some predictability skills in this environment, in this context. But yeah, so we'll close out there. Let's wrap it up. All right. If people want to see what you got going on, how do they reach you?
It's just Jonathan Moses Canine on everything: YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, whatever. I say you just look it up. You'll see a lot of stuff. A lot of the pet dog stuff is up there. Going to be putting some videos up at Crash here soon. I kind of going through that process and getting him ready for all the things he'll need to pass certification and what that looks like, and just the little things to make him easier to live with and safer as we go. Where again, he's not just predicting what's going to happen next. So if you want to see that, Jonathan Moses Canine on everything, say hi. What about you?
All right, and then mine is same as far as just my name and last name. So it's going to be Sean White, SEAN, the color white, and then the letter K, number 9. That's on Instagram, YouTube. TikTok is somewhat there. But anyways, more importantly, follow us on our Instagram page, wdw.podcast, so workingdogsandwhiskey.podcast. Follow us on Instagram. We are getting a lot of stuff together for next year. We're going to try to be less dog shit. Oh my gosh, dude. But we're going to try to get a Facebook page going. We have a Facebook page, but when I say going, actively putting input. So be on the lookout for that for those that are listening. Hey, we made it through another episode.
Oh yeah, we did.
Episode 13.
13, baby.
So happy about it. He's like,
oh yeah.
What'd you tell me?
Overachieving, man. Started in February, got 13 episodes out.
Yeah.
That means in 11 months, 13 episodes.
And we did.
I don't want to hear the timeline. I don't want to hear the timeline. Okay. I'm just saying it was done.
Oh man. All right, we'll take what we can get. But yeah, for those that are still listening, we don't make any money on this podcast. So if you do want to make some money, or I'm sorry, give us some money for John's personal services that he mentioned on episode 10. What's your number? 500,000? Okay.
500,000. You got the money. We can make some shit happen.
Yeah, I don't think that's gender specific. Again, that's not an inclusive package. That has nothing to do with me.
I need to see the money. This isn't a pay after kind of service.
I hope not, dude.
An IOU.
Yeah. Oh man. No, but all jokes aside, whoever's listening, we really appreciate it. Also, we really appreciate you if you do the like, subscribe, and give us a 5-star review. If you're going to give us something less, just continue what you're doing. Ignore us until you're a good episode. But
yeah, if it's not 5 stars, just skip it.
yeah,
Skip it.
just let it go. You're probably not listening at that point. But
Yeah, unless you're just
All
a hater.
now we're bashing people for listening.
Gaslighting them. If you didn't
Oh,
like
man.
this, you're probably just a hater.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah.
All right, and then since this will be coming out in the new year, what do we have going on in the new year? We are going to
Oh,
have
man.
some giveaways, right? Some merch.
Yep. Got some giveaways.
Uh-oh.
Dumbass just kicked his ball out from underneath the garage door.
Mm.
He's all but determined he's going to move that garage door.
I like it.
But
It's
we got
motivation.
mugs. We got
Mugs.
tumbler.
Okay.
And we got some hats, shirts. We'll probably give away some whiskey. So definitely follow, be a part of that. Maybe some beef treats.
Yeah, we got to get
them
them on. Well, if we can get the advertisement stuff going. We got a lot of big plans for what will be 2025 by the time this posts. So we have some bigger plans. Let's not say big plans. But yeah, please be on the lookout. We're going to get a website going. You'll be able to purchase some merchandise. We're going to be giving away a lot of good stuff. Yeah, it's going to be a good year. It's going to be a bigger year for Working Dogs and Whiskey. And yeah. All right. Thank you for listening. For those who have stuck with it. Goodbye.
Get it.